Have you ever wondered how a global superpower, one of the wealthiest nations the world had ever seen, could be brought to its knees? And not by some giant empire, but by a small group of traders in a private company. Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. This is the story of how a company literally conquered a country.
So to really get this, you have to picture India before all of this happened. We're talking about a land so rich, people said its fields literally grew gold. Its craftspeople had so much skill they were famous across the entire globe. For centuries, this place was known as the Sona Ki Chidiya, the golden bird. And this wasn't just a fairy tale. Look at the numbers. In the 18th century, India's economy was so massive it accounted for a quarter, a full 25% of the entire world's economy. It wasn't just rich, it was an economic powerhouse that had fought off invaders for centuries.
Which brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did a nation that could stand up to invaders like Alexander the Great, a country so vast that it took even the powerful Mughals generations to establish themselves, how did it fall to a mere company of merchants? Well, the answer isn't what you think. It wasn't won on a battlefield.
It all starts with the first step in their playbook, victory through deceit. See, the takeover of India didn't begin with some grand declaration of war. No, it started quietly, with a betrayal, a conspiracy that would decide the fate of India for the next 200 years.
The date was June 23, 1757. The place, Plassey. And while they call it the Battle of Plassey, let's be real, it wasn't much of a battle. It was a fix. The local ruler, the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, was ready for a fight. The problem was, his own commander-in-chief, a man named Mir Jafar, had already made a deal to sell him out.
And if you look at it on paper, it's almost laughable. The Nawab had this massive army, thousands and thousands of soldiers. The East India Company? Just a handful of men. It should have been an easy win for the Nawab. But the company had a secret weapon, and it wasn't guns or cannons. It was greed. You see, the company's man on the ground, Robert Clive, wasn't a brilliant general. He was a brilliant manipulator. He knew Mir Jafar wanted to be the ruler, so he made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Stand your army down during the battle, let us win, and we'll make you the new Nawab. It was as simple and as devastating as that.
So, with Bengal's rightful ruler dead, and their puppet on the throne, the East India Company moved on to Phase 2. The plunder of wealth. They weren't just traders anymore. They had political power, and they used it to kick off a looting spree on a scale that is just mind-boggling.
The plunder started immediately. Robert Clive himself wrote home, saying that the treasury in Bengal's capital had more riches than the entire city of London. And what did they do? They emptied it. They loaded all that gold and silver, the wealth of generations, onto 100 boats and just sailed it away. But that was just smashing the piggy bank. The real, systematic bleeding of India's wealth began in 1765, when the company got something called Diwani rights. This was the game changer. It basically gave a private corporation the legal right to collect taxes from millions of people. They went from being merchants to being the government, overnight. And you can see right here what that meant for the average person. Under the old Indian rulers, a farmer might pay about 10% of their harvest in taxes. Reasonable. The company came in and jacked that rate up to 50%. 50! It didn't matter if your crops failed or there was a flood. You paid or you lost everything. It completely crushed the farming economy.
This policy, this non-stop obsession with profit above all else, led directly to one of the worst man-made famines in the history of the world. In 1769, a drought hit. But instead of providing relief, the company saw a business opportunity. It gets even darker.
10 million people, 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal, starved to death. And let's be very clear, this wasn't just because of a drought. The company was hoarding grain to drive up prices. And then, and you can't even make this up, in the middle of the famine, they raised taxes by another 10%.
The accounts from that time are pure horror. The historian William Hunter wrote that things got so bad, the living were forced to eat the flesh of the dead. And while all this was happening, the East India Company's directors in London were celebrating one of their most profitable years ever.
So once they had broken the agricultural backbone of the country, they moved on to their next target. This phase was about the murder of skill. It wasn't enough to just take India's money. Now they had to destroy its world-famous industries, especially its incredible textiles.
You have to understand, for centuries, India was the place for textiles. Their fabrics, particularly the muslin from Dhaka, were so fine, so delicate, they were literally called woven air. People said you could take an entire sari and pass it right through a finger ring. That's the kind of quality British factories were up against.
And they just couldn't compete. So, they cheated. They rigged the whole system. They slammed taxes as high as 80% on Indian cloth being sold in Britain, pricing it out of the market. At the same time, they flooded India with their own machine-made cloth, with zero taxes. And they had the nerve to call this free trade.
But when rigging the market wasn't enough, they turned to outright brutal violence. There are absolutely horrific reports of company officials forcibly cutting off the thumbs of master weavers, physically ensuring they could never again practice their craft.
The Governor-General of India himself, Lord William Bentinck, summed up the result with this chilling quote: "The country was completely deindustrialized. In just a few generations, India went from being the world's greatest producer of textiles to a captive market forced to buy British goods."
Which brings us to our final chapter, the price of freedom. After about 100 years of this kind of brutal exploitation, the anger just exploded. In 1857, a massive rebellion swept across the country. It ended the East India Company's rule, sure, but then the British Crown took over directly. And the cruelty didn't stop. If anything, it just got more organized.
Just look at the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919. A British general trapped a crowd of thousands of peaceful, unarmed protesters inside a walled garden and ordered his soldiers to open fire. For 10 solid minutes, they fired 1,650 rounds into the crowd. That general later said his goal wasn't just to disperse them, but to create a moral effect, to terrorize the entire Indian population.
So, after all was said and done, what was the total price tag for 200 years of British rule? The human cost, of course, is impossible to calculate, but economists have tried to figure out the financial drain. Their estimate? The British siphoned a staggering $45 trillion out of India.
When the British finally packed up and left in 1947, this is what they left behind: a nation that was now one of the poorest in the world. Its industries were crippled, it had suffered through devastating famines, and to top it all off, they partitioned the country, drawing lines on a map that created wounds that still haven't healed.
But here's the thing. That's not where the story ends, because after 2 centuries of having its wealth drained, its people starved, and its industries destroyed, the spirit of the place was never truly broken. They could take the gold from the golden bird, but they couldn't stop it from figuring out how to fly again. And today, that's exactly what it's doing.